One of these men had been dead for centuries. The other had vanished from the earth without passing through an ordinary death. And yet, on a mountain in Galilee, both of them suddenly appeared beside Jesus. Moses, Elijah, alive, speaking with him as though centuries had never separated them. Peter, James, and John were standing there, watching something no one could have prepared them to see. But there was a problem. Moses had died. Elijah had been taken from the earth generations earlier, so how could both of them be standing there with Jesus? Was this a vision? Had God brought a dead man back? Or was something happening on that mountain that the disciples themselves did not yet understand? The answer is buried inside a few details that are easy to read past, because this was not simply a strange meeting between Jesus and two men from Israel's distant past. Something much bigger was happening, and for a few moments, Peter, James, and John were allowed to see a part of God's story that had been unfolding for centuries, a story involving the law, the prophets, the Exodus, and ultimately, the man standing between them, Jesus. But before we can understand why Moses and Elijah were there, we have to go back to the mountain itself, to the moment when Jesus revealed something about himself that his disciples had never seen before. Before the disciples could understand who was standing beside Jesus, they had to experience the mountain. Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John away from the crowds and led them upward. The climb was quiet. No crowds followed them. No one was calling for healing. No one was pressing around Jesus with questions. For a little while, there was only the mountain, the three disciples, and their teacher. They had walked with Jesus through the villages of Galilee. They had watched him heal the sick, confront demons, calm storms, and speak with an authority unlike anyone they had ever known. But they had never seen what was about to happen. At some point on that mountain, Jesus stopped looking ordinary. His face began to shine like the sun. His clothes became dazzling white, and the disciples realized that the man they had followed through the roads of Galilee was revealing a glory they had never seen before. Then the scene changed again. Two figures appeared beside him, Moses and Elijah. The disciples somehow recognized them. That detail alone is astonishing. They were not looking at strangers whose identities needed to be explained. They knew who they were. And now these men from Israel's distant past were standing beside Jesus as though they had stepped directly out of the pages of Scripture. Peter, James, and John could only watch. And Peter, overwhelmed by what he was seeing, began to speak. He suggested making 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. It was an impulsive response. He did not understand what he was witnessing. He simply wanted to do something. Perhaps he wanted the moment to last, and that makes Peter's reaction strangely human. When something is too overwhelming to explain, sometimes the first instinct is not to understand it. It is simply to hold on to it. But while Peter was still speaking, the mountain was about to reveal why these two men had appeared. Because Moses and Elijah were not there by accident, and their presence beside Jesus carried a meaning that reached far beyond that single moment. To understand why Moses and Elijah appeared beside Jesus, we have to understand what they represented. Moses was more than the man who led Israel out of Egypt. He was the man through whom God gave Israel the law. He stood on Mount Sinai beneath the cloud and fire of God's presence. He received the commandments that would shape the life of Israel for generations, but Moses also left behind a promise. He told the people that God would one day raise up a prophet like him, someone they were commanded to listen to. For centuries, Israel waited for that promise to be fulfilled. Then there was Elijah. Elijah belonged to a different part of Israel's story. He was a prophet who stood against kings, confronted idolatry, and called God's people back when they had wandered away. He stood on Mount Carmel and watched fire fall from heaven. He experienced victory, fear, exhaustion, and loneliness. And near the end of the Old Testament, the prophet Malachi connected Elijah's name with the coming day of the Lord. So Elijah became part of Israel's expectation. Moses carried the memory of God's law. Elijah carried the voice of the prophets. And now, on a mountain in Galilee, both were standing beside Jesus. That is what makes the scene so extraordinary. The disciples were not simply looking at two famous men from the past. They were seeing two enormous threads of Israel's story converge in front of them: the law, the prophets, and Jesus standing between them. But there is an important difference between these two men. Their stories did not end in the same way. Moses went through death. Elijah did not experience an ordinary death at all. And that means the mystery we opened at the beginning actually contains two different questions. How could Elijah be there? And perhaps even more difficult, how could Moses be there? To answer the first question, we have to go back to one of the strangest departures recorded in the Old Testament, because Elijah did not leave this world through a grave. He was taken, and what happened next would make his appearance beside Jesus far less mysterious than it first seemed. The first mystery is easier to answer. Elijah had not died in the ordinary way. The Old Testament tells us that Elijah was walking with his disciple Elisha when something extraordinary happened. A chariot of fire appeared. Horses of fire separated the two men, and then Elijah was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. He was gone. There was no ordinary burial, no grave for the people of Israel to visit, no body left behind. Elijah had been taken from the earth by God. That matters because when he later appears beside Jesus, Scripture does not require us to imagine a dead prophet being brought back to life. His departure had already been different from the beginning, and there is another man in Scripture whose story carries a similar mystery. Enoch. Genesis says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. Hebrews later explains that Enoch was taken so that he would not see death. Elijah's story is not identical to Enoch's, but both remind us of something the disciples already understood. God's authority over life and death is not limited by what human beings consider possible. So Elijah standing beside Jesus is extraordinary. But it is not the deepest mystery on that mountain, because there was another man standing there whose story was completely different. Moses had not been taken into heaven like Elijah. Moses had died. The final chapter of Deuteronomy says it plainly. Moses died in the land of Moab, and then the Bible gives us one of the strangest details in his entire story. God himself buried him. No one knew where his grave was. The man who had led Israel out of Egypt, the man who had stood before God on Sinai, the man whose name was woven into the identity of Israel, was buried in a place no one could find. And centuries later, that same Moses was standing alive beside Jesus. Now the question becomes much harder. What happened between that hidden grave in Moab and that mountain in Galilee? Moses did not leave the earth like Elijah. His story ended at the edge of the Promised Land. After 40 years in the wilderness, Moses climbed Mount Nebo and looked across the land he had spent his life leading Israel toward. He would see it, but he would not enter it. Then Moses died in the land of Moab. The Bible is remarkably direct about it, but what happens next is unusual. Deuteronomy says that God buried Moses and that no one knew the place of his burial. That detail may seem small. It is not. Moses was one of the most important figures in Israel's history. His life had shaped the nation, his words had shaped its faith, and his memory would remain part of Israel for generations. Yet there was no known tomb, no place where the people could gather around his grave, no monument marking the final resting place of the man who had stood before Pharaoh and received the law on Sinai. And then, centuries later, Moses appears alive beside Jesus. How the New Testament gives us one strange clue. In the letter of Jude, we are told that Michael the archangel disputed with the devil over the body of Moses. That is all Jude tells us. He does not explain why Satan wanted the body. He does not tell us what happened to it afterward, and he does not connect the dispute explicitly to the Transfiguration. That distinction matters, because it is tempting to take this mysterious passage and build a complete explanation around it. Some interpreters have suggested that the dispute over Moses' body may somehow be connected to his later appearance beside Jesus. Perhaps his body was preserved. Perhaps God had a purpose for Moses that extended beyond his death. But Scripture never actually says that Moses was resurrected temporarily for the Transfiguration. We should not turn a possibility into a certainty. What we can say is much more fascinating. The Bible deliberately leaves a gap between Moses' death and the moment when he appears with Jesus. We are told that Moses died. We are told that God buried him. We are told that his grave was unknown. We are told of a mysterious dispute over his body. And then, centuries later, Moses is standing on a mountain, speaking with Jesus. The mechanism remains hidden, but perhaps the reason is about to become clearer. Because the Gospel of Luke tells us something the other accounts make easier to overlook. Moses and Elijah were not simply standing there. They were talking to Jesus, and Luke tells us what they were talking about. A single word changes the entire scene. Exodus. The word Luke uses is easy to miss. He says that Moses and Elijah were speaking with Jesus about his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. But the Greek word Luke uses is not simply a word for leaving, it is exodos. Exodus. For Moses, that word would have carried an enormous weight. His entire life had been shaped by an exodus. He had stood before Pharaoh while Israel was trapped in slavery. He had watched God send judgment upon Egypt. He had seen the Passover. He had led Israel through the sea when God opened a path where there had been none. And he had watched an enslaved people begin a journey toward freedom. That was Moses' exodus. But now, centuries later, Moses was standing beside Jesus, discussing another exodus, one that would happen in Jerusalem. And this time, the enemy would not be Pharaoh, the chains would not be iron, the destination would not simply be a piece of land. Jesus was preparing to confront something deeper: sin, suffering, death, the grave. The first Exodus had delivered Israel from slavery under a human ruler. The Exodus Jesus was about to accomplish would open a way through the power of death itself. And suddenly, the conversation on the mountain becomes much more than a strange meeting between Jesus and two figures from Israel's past. Moses was not there because Jesus needed advice from an ancient prophet. He was there because the story God had begun through Moses was reaching a greater fulfillment. The first Exodus had become a pattern, a preview, a shadow of something still to come. Israel had once passed through the waters and emerged from slavery. Jesus was preparing to pass through death and emerge victorious, and the timing makes the scene even more powerful. Jesus was not discussing some distant possibility. Jerusalem was already ahead of him. He knew what was waiting there: the arrest, the suffering, the cross. And yet on the mountain, Moses and Elijah were speaking with him about it. That means the Transfiguration was not an interruption in the story. It was preparation. The disciples had already struggled with Jesus' words about his coming death. They expected the Messiah to bring victory. They did not yet understand that his victory would first pass through suffering. So before they watched Jesus walk toward the darkest moment of his earthly life, they were allowed to see him in glory. And there was still one question left. If Moses represented the law and Elijah represented the prophets, what did their presence beside Jesus actually say about him? The answer would come not from Moses, not from Elijah, but from heaven itself. The disciples had barely begun to process what they were seeing when a bright cloud covered them. And suddenly, this mountain began to resemble another mountain from Israel's story. Moses had once stood beneath the glory of God on Sinai. Now Moses was standing on another mountain, but this time he was not receiving the law. He was standing beside the one the law had been pointing toward. Then the voice came, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Those final words were not accidental. Listen to him. Centuries earlier, Moses had spoken of a prophet God would raise up, one like him. Now the disciples were standing before that promised one. The law had spoken. The prophets had spoken. But now God himself was directing their attention to Jesus. And then something happened that may be the most important detail of the entire scene. The cloud lifted. The disciples looked again. Moses was gone. Elijah was gone. Jesus remained. If you had been standing on that mountain with Peter, James, and John, what would have shocked you most? Seeing Moses and Elijah, seeing Jesus transformed, or hearing the voice of God? I'd genuinely like to know, because for a few moments, the entire story of Israel had stood on that mountain. The law, the prophets, the promises, the expectations, and then, one by one, everything disappeared except Jesus. Moses was not there to compete with him. Elijah was not there to compete with him. They were witnesses, they were pointing beyond themselves. Their presence told the disciples that Jesus was not disconnected from the story of Israel. He was the fulfillment toward which that story had been moving. And this is where Peter's earlier reaction becomes even more revealing. He had wanted 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. But heaven did not leave them with 3. It left them with 1, Jesus. The disciples had wanted to preserve the moment. God wanted them to understand the message, listen to him. That command would become more important than they could possibly realize, because they were about to leave the mountain, and Jesus was about to walk toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward the darkest hours they had ever witnessed. They had just seen him in glory. Soon, they would see him in suffering, and the memory of that mountain would be the one thing they could carry with them when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The mountain was not the destination. Jesus and the 3 disciples still had to come down. The silence of the mountain would soon be replaced by the noise of Jerusalem, but Peter, James, and John did not yet understand what was waiting for them. Jesus had already told his disciples that he would suffer. He had spoken about rejection, about death, about rising again. But those words were difficult to accept. They had seen Jesus heal the sick. They had watched him command demons. They had seen crowds gather wherever he went. They believed he was the Messiah, but they did not expect the Messiah's path to lead through a Roman cross, and that is why the Transfiguration matters. Before the disciples saw Jesus humiliated, they saw him glorified. Before they watched soldiers arrest him, they watched his face shine like the sun. Before they saw his clothes stained with blood, they saw them become brilliantly white. Before they heard accusations against him, they heard the voice of the Father. The mountain gave them something they would desperately need later, a memory. Because soon, the same 3 men would follow Jesus into another place, not another mountain, a garden, Gethsemane. And there, the contrast could not have been greater. On the mountain, Jesus had been radiant. In the garden, he would be overwhelmed with sorrow. On the mountain, heaven had spoken. In the garden, Jesus would fall to the ground in anguish. On the mountain, the disciples had been terrified by the glory they could not understand. In the garden, they would struggle simply to stay awake. Yet Jesus had chosen these same 3 men to witness both moments. Peter, James, John. They would see the glory, and they would see the agony. Perhaps that was exactly what they needed. Because when Jesus was arrested, beaten, mocked, and finally nailed to a cross, everything they believed about him would seem to collapse. The man they had seen shining with heavenly glory would suddenly appear powerless. The man who had commanded storms would remain silent before his accusers. The man who had raised others from the dead would allow himself to be killed. But the suffering would not erase what they had seen. The cross would not mean that Jesus had ceased to be the Son. The darkness would not mean that God had lost control of the story. The disciples had already been given a glimpse beyond the darkness. They just did not yet understand what that glimpse meant. They would understand later, after Jerusalem, after the cross, after the tomb. Only then would the mountain begin to make sense. If you enjoy seeing the Bible brought to life through stories like this, subscribe. There are many more moments in Scripture that become completely different when you see them this way. The disciples could not understand the mountain yet. They had seen Jesus in glory. They had heard the Father's voice. They had watched Moses and Elijah disappear, but they still could not see the whole story. Then came Jerusalem, the arrest, the cross, the tomb. For a time, everything they believed seemed to have collapsed. The Messiah they had followed was dead. The one they had seen shining on the mountain had been placed behind a stone. But then the stone was rolled away. Jesus was alive. And suddenly the disciples could begin looking backward. The mountain had not been promising that Jesus would avoid suffering. It had been revealing who he was before they watched him suffer. The glory was real. The cross was real. And the resurrection proved that the cross had never been the end. Now the conversation about the Exodus made sense. Moses had led Israel out of slavery. Jesus had accomplished a greater deliverance through death and resurrection. The law made sense. The prophets made sense. The voice from the cloud made sense. Even Moses and Elijah standing beside Jesus made sense in a way they could not have understood that night. The pieces were finally coming together, and Peter never forgot what he had seen. Years later, he would write that he and the other apostles had not followed cleverly invented stories. They had been eyewitnesses of Christ's majesty. Peter remembered the mountain, he remembered the voice, he remembered the glory, but now he could understand what that moment had been preparing them for. The Transfiguration was a glimpse of the destination before they had walked the road. It showed them glory before suffering. It showed them the sun before the cross. And it showed them that the story of Israel was moving toward Jesus. The mountain had been real. The darkness had been real. The tomb had been real, but the tomb was not the end. And that leaves us with one final question. If Moses and Elijah were there to point toward Jesus, if the Father himself told the disciples to listen to him, then why has this strange moment on a mountain mattered for so many generations? Perhaps the answer is simpler than the mystery that first brought us there, because the Transfiguration was never ultimately about Moses and Elijah. It was about Jesus. And once we see that, the final moment on the mountain becomes impossible to forget. So we can finally return to the question that brought us to the mountain. How could Moses and Elijah be there? The Bible gives us part of the answer. Elijah had been taken by God without an ordinary death. Moses had died, been buried by God, and left behind a mystery Scripture never fully explains. Jude tells us of a dispute over his body, but never says that Moses was resurrected for the Transfiguration. The mechanism remains hidden, but perhaps that is not the question the mountain was designed to answer. Moses and Elijah were not the destination. They were witnesses. Moses stood for the law. Elijah stood for the prophets. The Exodus pointed forward. The promises pointed forward. And on that mountain, all of those threads converged on Jesus. The cloud disappears. Moses is gone. Elijah is gone. And Jesus remains. The disciples had arrived with questions. They left with something more important than an explanation. They had seen who Jesus was. We often want God to explain every mystery before we take the next step. Peter, James, and John did not understand everything they had witnessed. But they had seen the mountain, they had heard the voice, and when everything else disappeared, Jesus remained. Sometimes faith does not begin with having every answer. Sometimes it begins with knowing who to follow when you do not have the answers. The disciples came down from the mountain. Jesus continued toward Jerusalem, toward suffering, toward the cross, toward the tomb, and beyond the tomb, toward resurrection. The mountain had given them a glimpse of glory before the darkness. And perhaps that is the final mystery of the Transfiguration. Moses was there, Elijah was there, but they were never the center. They were pointing to the one who was Jesus. So when you return to this ancient scene, don't only ask how Moses and Elijah appeared. Ask why God wanted them there. Ask why they spoke with Jesus about his exodus. Ask why the Father said, "Listen to him." And remember what the disciples saw when the cloud lifted. Not Moses, not Elijah, Jesus alone. Because sometimes the story becomes clearer not when every mystery is solved, but when you finally see who the story has been pointing toward all along. Jesus. Listen to him. And if this story made you see the Transfiguration differently, leave a like. It helps us bring more stories from Scripture to life like this.